The evening was supposed to be unforgettable. The grand hall was decorated with tall golden curtains that touched the floor, and hundreds of small lights glowed like stars above the crowd. Guests arrived in their best clothes, their shoes shining, their laughter filling the air. The hall was alive with excitement, because tonight was meant to be the special performance of the most famous singer in the city. People had been waiting for weeks, some even for months, to hear her voice. The tables were filled with food, silver dishes shining under the bright lights. The scent of roasted bread and sweet desserts mixed with the fragrance of flowers placed carefully at every corner. The air was filled with joy, and everyone thought nothing could go wrong. Among the servants moving quietly between the tables was a young maid named Myra. She carried a tray of glasses, her eyes lowered as she walked carefully so that not a single drink spilled. She had been working in the hall for only a year, but she already knew her place. No one noticed her, no one looked at her face. She was there to serve, not to be seen. Myra accepted this truth, though in her heart she often dreamed of something more. Myra loved music. When her work ended at night and the hall was empty, she would sometimes stand on the same stage that famous singers used. She would close her eyes and sing softly, pretending the empty chairs were filled with people listening only to her. But as soon as she remembered who she was, a simple maid, she would stop, pick up her broom, and return to cleaning. Her dream was too far away, and dreams were not for people like her. As the guests took their seats, the host of the evening stepped onto the stage. He wore a bright blue coat, his hair combed perfectly, his voice loud and cheerful. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "thank you for joining us on this wonderful evening. Tonight, we present to you the voice that has captured hearts everywhere." The one and only. The crowd clapped loudly before he could even finish the name. Everyone knew who it was. The star of the night, the singer who could make people cry with one note. People leaned forward in their seats, eager for the curtains to rise. But then, before the music started, a whisper passed between the musicians. Something was wrong. The host's smile froze for a moment. He turned to one of his helpers, who hurriedly whispered something in his ear. The color drained from his face. He returned to the microphone and cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, we regret to inform you," he paused, his voice trembling slightly. "The performer, she will not be joining us tonight. Due to an unexpected illness, she has cancelled her appearance." For a moment, the hall was silent. It was as if no one understood what he had said. Then the murmurs began. Guests looked at each other in disbelief. "What? Cancelled?" someone muttered loudly. Another shook his head, saying, "I came all this way for nothing." Others groaned, their faces filled with disappointment. The cheerful atmosphere of the evening fell apart. Some guests stood up in anger, while others demanded refunds. The host tried to calm them, raising his hands and asking for patience. "Please, everyone, remain seated. We will still have music tonight. We will find a solution." But his words sounded weak, even to himself. Myra stood quietly in the corner, still holding her tray. She watched the scene unfold with wide eyes. Her heart ached with the same disappointment, though she had never hoped to hear the singer up close. She had only wanted to feel the magic of music fill the air, just once in her life. But now, the dream of this evening was broken. The musicians lowered their instruments. The dancers who had prepared to follow the singer's song looked lost. The hall felt heavy with restless voices. "This is a waste of time," someone said. "I dressed for nothing," another complained. The sound of laughter that once filled the room was replaced with sharp tones of irritation. In the middle of this chaos, Myra's eyes wandered to the empty stage. The curtains were still closed, the light still waiting to shine on someone. A strange thought passed through her heart. What if someone else could sing? What if someone could save this night? She quickly shook the thought away. That was impossible. She was just a maid. But the night was far from over, and fate had a way of turning eyes toward the most unexpected person. Myra did not yet know that before the evening ended, every guest in the hall would hear her voice. The grand hall still buzzed with noise after the announcement. The disappointment of the crowd filled the air like a storm cloud. The guests, who had arrived with shining faces, now looked restless and impatient. Some tapped their fingers on the tables, others whispered angrily to their companions. The host tried to smile and speak words of comfort, but no one was really listening. Everyone had come for the star performer, and without her, the night already felt ruined. At the back of the hall, Myra stood silently, her tray now empty. She had placed the glasses back in the kitchen, but her eyes still wandered toward the stage. The curtains hung heavy and unmoving, like a promise that had been broken. She could feel the sadness inside her chest. Music had been stolen from the night, and there was nothing anyone could do. Or so she thought. From one of the front tables, a loud laugh suddenly broke through the restless murmurs. A tall man with a sharp voice leaned back in his chair, pointing his finger toward Myra. "Why don't we let the maid sing for us?" he said with a mocking smile. "She's standing there, staring at the stage as if it belongs to her." The people around him chuckled, and soon the laughter spread. Some clapped their hands as if the man had told the funniest joke of the night. Myra froze in place. Her cheeks turned hot, and she quickly lowered her gaze to the floor. She wished she could disappear, sink into the ground, and hide from all the eyes that now looked at her. "She must know some tune," another guest added with a sneer. "Why else is she staring so much at the curtains? Come on, girl, sing for us." The teasing voices grew louder. It was not real encouragement, it was mockery. They wanted to laugh at her, not listen. To them, she was just a servant, someone meant to carry trays and clean the floor, not to stand where the great singer was supposed to stand. Myra's hands trembled. She held the edge of her apron tightly, her heart beating fast. She wanted to run, to escape the hall before the laughter grew sharper. But another part of her, deep inside, refused to bend. Their words hurt, but they also sparked something she had long buried: her secret love for singing. She remembered the nights when the hall was empty, when no one was around to mock her. She remembered standing on the same stage in the silence of the dark, singing softly to herself, pretending she belonged there. She remembered how free she had felt in those moments, how alive. The guests did not know any of this. To them, it was a game. To Myra, it was a wound that could either break her or push her forward. The host, noticing the growing laughter, tried to calm the crowd. "Please, please, let us not make fun of the staff," he said with a nervous smile. But his words only made the teasing louder. "What harm is there in it?" one man called out. "The evening is ruined anyway. Let the maid give us a show." The crowd clapped in jest, stamping their feet on the floor, creating a rhythm of mockery. All eyes turned to Myra. She stood still, her breath uneven. Inside her mind, two voices fought. One told her to run, to hide, to let the laughter win. The other whispered, "This is your moment. Do not be afraid." Myra lifted her head slowly. Her eyes, though filled with fear, also held a quiet strength. She took a step forward. The laughter softened for a moment, surprised by her movement. "I will sing," she said softly. Her voice was not loud, but it carried across the hall. The guests stopped for a second, blinking at her. Then more laughter followed, some clapping mockingly as if they had already won. "Good. The maid will entertain us," someone shouted. Myra's heart raced faster, but she did not step back. She placed her tray on the nearest table, wiped her damp palms on her apron, and began to walk toward the stage. Each step felt heavier than the last, but also stronger. She did not know what would happen. She did not know if her voice would betray her or if the guests would laugh harder once she began. But she knew one thing clearly: she would no longer hide. At the edge of the stage, she paused. The lights above seemed brighter now, almost blinding. The curtains loomed over her like a mountain she had to climb. Behind her, the crowd waited, some with mocking smiles, others with curious eyes. Myra took a deep breath. She remembered her mother's soft lullabies, the gentle songs she used to hear before sleep, songs that made even the hardest days feel a little lighter. That memory gave her courage. Her fear was still there, but it was no longer stronger than her voice. The hall, once filled with laughter, now waited to see what the maid would do. And Myra, the girl no one ever noticed, stood at the doorway of her destiny. Myra stood at the foot of the stage, her hands trembling as if they no longer belonged to her. The grand hall, which only minutes ago had been filled with laughter and chatter, now fell into a curious hush. The guests leaned forward in their chairs, their eyes fixed on her small figure. Some smiled mockingly, waiting for her to embarrass herself. Others whispered, wondering if she was truly brave enough to do it. The lights above the stage glared down, brighter than she had ever imagined. For years she had cleaned under these very lights, polishing the floor until it shone, dusting the curtains until her fingers grew sore. She had always admired the stage from far below, a place meant for stars and artists, not for someone like her. Yet here she was, her feet climbing the steps, one shaky step at a time. The host watched her nervously, uncertain whether to stop her or let her continue. His lips parted as if to say something, but then he saw the determination in her eyes. He closed his mouth and quietly stepped aside. Perhaps even he wanted to see what she would do. As Myra reached the center of the stage, her heart pounded so loudly it felt as though the whole hall could hear it. She could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes pressing against her. Her palms were damp, her throat dry, and fear coiled tightly in her chest. She wanted to run. She wanted to hide. But her feet refused to move backward. The crowd murmured again. "Come on, Maid, let's hear you," one man called out. Another laughed, "Don't faint now." A few clapped their hands in rhythm, teasing her before she even opened her mouth. Myra closed her eyes. The sound of their voices blurred into a distant hum. She remembered nights when the hall was empty, when no one mocked her. She remembered singing into the darkness, her voice echoing softly through the silence, giving her comfort after long days of hard work. Those songs were her secret treasure, the one thing that made her feel alive. She took a deep breath, slow and steady. The air filled her lungs, calming the storm inside her chest. She whispered silently to herself, "Do not be afraid. This is your moment." The hall grew quieter. Even the guests who mocked her began to wait. Something about her stillness drew them in, as if they sensed that what was about to happen was different from the joke they had expected. Myra lifted her chin. Her eyes opened, no longer lowered in shame but steady with quiet strength. She was still afraid, yes, but fear no longer chained her. She stood not as a servant now, but as someone about to share her truth. She thought of her mother. She thought of the soft lullabies that once carried her to sleep, the warm voice that used to fill their small home. Her mother had always said, "A voice carries the heart. If you sing with honesty, people will listen." Myra held on to those words like a lantern in the dark. Her lips parted. But before the first note came, a heavy silence spread across the hall. It was the silence before a storm, the kind that made people hold their breath. The guests leaned forward unconsciously, their curiosity stronger than their scorn. For Myra, that silence was terrifying, and yet it gave her strength. She pressed her hands together to stop their trembling. Her eyes scanned the room, just for a heartbeat, and she saw not faces but shadows. In that moment, the hall no longer felt like an enemy. It was only a place, like the empty nights she had sung alone. Then she took another breath, deeper this time, as if drawing courage straight from her soul. She was ready. The first note was still trapped inside her chest, waiting to be born. But in that pause, Myra discovered something important. The crowd could laugh. They could mock. They could wait for her to fail. But none of that mattered, because this was her choice. She had stepped onto the stage with her own feet, and no one could take that away from her. The audience shifted uneasily, wondering why she had not started yet. But in truth, the longer she stood in that silence, the more powerful it became. She was no longer the maid being laughed at, she was the center of attention, commanding the room without saying a word. Myra allowed herself a small, steadying smile. The fear inside her loosened. Her heart was still racing, but it beat now with courage rather than only dread. She was ready to sing. The lights glowed brighter above her, as though the stage itself had been waiting all along for this moment. The hall, restless and loud only minutes ago, now sat in expectant silence. And Myra, the girl who once only dreamed in shadows, stood tall in the center of the stage, her voice about to rise and change everything. The grand hall held its breath. The chandeliers sparkled above, their light falling gently on Myra as she stood in the center of the stage. She was small compared to the size of the hall, yet every eye was fixed on her. The laughter, the jokes, the noise, all of it had faded. What remained was silence, heavy and expectant. Myra could hear her heartbeat in her ears. It was fast, like the beating of a drum before a march. Her hands trembled, but she held them together firmly. Fear still lived inside her chest, but now it had changed. It was no longer the kind of fear that forced her to hide, it was the kind that made her want to rise higher. Her gaze lifted slowly, sweeping across the hall. She saw rows of faces staring back at her. Some carried smirks, waiting to see her fail. Others leaned forward, curious, perhaps even hopeful. And yet, Myra did not focus on them. In her mind, she saw only her mother. She remembered a small room with a single lamp glowing in the corner, her mother humming softly as she cooked. She remembered being a little girl, listening to those songs that made the world feel less heavy. Her mother's voice had always been gentle, never meant for grand stages, but it had carried warmth strong enough to heal. Myra whispered silently to herself, "Sing as if you are singing for her. Sing with the truth of your heart." The musicians at the side of the hall shifted uneasily. They had lowered their instruments earlier, expecting nothing, but now even they seemed unsure. Should they join her? Should they remain silent? For now, they waited, their eyes drawn to the quiet strength in the maid who had dared to step into the star's place. Myra closed her eyes. The hall grew even quieter, if that was possible. People who had been ready to laugh found themselves waiting, their voices caught in their throats. Something about the way she stood, something about the stillness around her, made the moment feel important. She inhaled deeply. The air filled her lungs, steady and full. She held it for a heartbeat, letting her fear settle, letting courage rise. Then her lips parted. But still, she did not sing. Not yet. The silence stretched, like the pause before thunder splits the sky. That pause carried more power than the guests expected. They shifted in their seats, restless, but also unable to look away. Inside, Myra was fighting her last battle. Doubts whispered, "What if they laugh louder when you begin? What if your voice cracks? What if you cannot finish?" But another voice answered, "Even if they laugh, at least you dared. Even if you fail, you tried. That is more than hiding forever." Her chest rose and fell once more. Slowly, her eyes opened. This time, they were steady. The timid girl who had served quietly in the shadows was still there, but beside her stood someone stronger, someone who wanted to be heard. Her gaze turned toward the crowd, not with pride, not with anger, but with honesty. She was about to share something real, something no mockery could destroy. The hall felt frozen in time. The chandeliers did not sway, the glasses on the tables stood untouched, and even the air seemed unwilling to move. And then, at last, the first note left her lips. It was soft, fragile, like the first drop of rain touching dry earth. For a moment, it seemed too delicate to survive. But then it lingered, pure and clear, carrying across the hall. The guests blinked in surprise. Some who had been smirking felt their expressions fade. The sound was not the broken, nervous attempt they had expected. It was something else entirely. Myra's voice wavered slightly, but it held. She let the note flow, remembering the songs of her childhood, remembering nights when she sang to herself in the dark. Each memory gave her strength, each breath carried her further away from fear. The musicians, moved without realizing it, lifted their instruments gently. They did not play loudly, only softly, following her lead. A faint melody rose behind her voice, wrapping it in warmth without stealing its light. The hall listened. Myra felt the sound vibrating in her chest, traveling through her lips, echoing across the room. With every word, every note, she let go of the weight she had carried for years, the weight of being unseen, unheard, unvalued. She was not singing for fame, not for applause. She was singing because the music inside her could no longer remain silent. And though she had only just begun, the storm had already started to rise. The first note floated gently through the air, like a fragile thread of light. For a moment, some thought it would break, but instead it grew steadier, wrapping around the silence of the hall. Myra's voice trembled, yet it carried something deeper than perfection. It carried truth. The guests who had expected to laugh leaned back in surprise. A few exchanged looks, unsure if they had imagined what they just heard. Myra did not give them time to doubt. She continued, her next note stronger than the last, shaping into a melody that filled every corner of the hall. The chandeliers above seemed to glow warmer as her voice rose. The polished floor reflected her small figure on the stage, no longer just a maid but someone transformed by courage. Her voice was not the trained, polished sound of a star performer. It was raw, honest, and alive. Each word touched the heart more than perfect skill ever could. At the start, her hands shook. But as the music moved through her, the trembling eased. Her shoulders straightened, her chest lifted, and she began to sing with the full strength of her heart. The musicians, still unsure, followed carefully. The violinist drew his bow softly, matching her tone. The pianist pressed keys gently, letting her voice lead. What began as a single fragile note turned into a river of sound, flowing with quiet power. The hall was no longer restless. The mocking voices had gone silent. The guests, who had laughed and pointed only minutes before, now sat still, their eyes fixed on her. The change was so sudden it was almost unbelievable. A moment ago, they had seen a maid. Now, they saw someone who held the room in her hands. Myra felt the change too. She could sense the quiet, the way the air listened. It gave her more courage. She let the song rise higher, her voice carrying both pain and hope. She sang not just with sound but with every memory, every dream she had hidden away. She remembered the long nights when she was alone in her small room, whispering songs into the darkness. She remembered the times she had swept the stage, wondering what it would feel like to stand there. She remembered her mother's words, "Sing with your heart, and people will listen." Her song carried all of this. It carried the weight of being unseen and the courage of stepping into the light. It was a song of longing, but also of strength. It was soft enough to make hearts ache, yet strong enough to break the pride of those who thought her small. One guest in the front row, who had mocked her earlier, found his laughter gone. His lips parted slightly, but no words came. Something in the maid's voice held him captive, as if he had been caught in a story he did not expect to hear. Another woman, dressed in silk, felt tears sting her eyes. She blinked quickly, embarrassed, but she could not stop listening. The maid's voice seemed to touch something she had forgotten, a sadness buried deep, a hope she thought she had lost. Myra sang higher, the melody rising like a bird taking flight. Her fear had melted into determination. Every note stretched across the hall, soft at first and then powerful, until it seemed the very walls carried her song. The hall that once mocked her was now silent, completely silent. Even the servants standing at the edges stopped moving, their trays frozen in their hands, their eyes fixed on Myra. They too had always been invisible, just like her, but in this moment they felt as if her voice was lifting all of them with her. The chandeliers gleamed. The golden curtains seemed to shimmer. The stage, once too large for her, now looked made for her alone. Her song reached its middle, and her voice grew stronger still. It was no longer soft or hesitant, it was powerful, filled with fire. Each note carried across the hall, echoing like thunder that could not be ignored. Some guests bowed their heads, ashamed of their earlier laughter. Others sat frozen, unable to believe that the maid they had mocked was the one commanding their hearts now. But Myra did not think of them. She sang as if the hall were empty, as if only her mother's memory listened. She poured her soul into the song, every breath a gift, every note a promise that she was more than what the world had told her. And when her voice soared to its highest point, the hall seemed to shake with it. It was as if the walls themselves had been waiting to carry her sound, to let it live inside them. The maid who once only dreamed had broken the silence, broken the pride of the crowd, and broken the chains of fear that once held her back. Her voice had truly broken the room. Myra's voice flowed like water over stone, smoothing every corner of the hall. What began as soft and trembling had now become rich and full, strong enough to reach the very back row. The sound did not simply pass through the air, it touched hearts. At first, the guests had been surprised into silence. Now, they were spellbound. They leaned forward without realizing it, their eyes following every small movement of the maid who only moments ago had been the target of laughter. Her voice carried something they did not expect. It was not the polished perfection of a famous singer, but it had honesty, and honesty carried more power than skill. In her song was sorrow, the sorrow of being overlooked, and the courage of standing up anyway. In her song was hope, a hope so fragile yet so bright that it made the heart ache. The hall, once filled with noise and restlessness, now felt sacred, as if everyone was inside a story too fragile to break. Even the sound of breathing seemed too loud against her voice. A man near the front, who had shouted at her earlier, pressed a hand against his chest. He did not understand why his throat felt tight, why his eyes burned with tears he did not want to show. He had mocked her, yes, but now her song made him remember his own childhood, the days when his mother used to sing while working in their small home. He lowered his gaze, ashamed but unable to stop listening. A young woman in a silk dress, her jewels shining under the chandeliers, felt her tears fall silently onto her lap. She had come expecting joy, entertainment, and laughter, but instead she found herself reminded of her own hidden pain. The maid's voice seemed to reach inside her, pulling out feelings she had buried. She covered her mouth, afraid someone might see her crying, but she did not look away from the stage. At the edge of the hall, other maids and servants stood frozen. They had always been silent shadows, working quietly and unnoticed. But now, one of their own stood in the center, and her song felt like it belonged to all of them. They exchanged looks, their eyes shining with pride and wonder. For once, someone who was like them was being heard, truly heard. Myra herself felt the transformation too. With every note, her fear melted further, replaced by warmth that spread through her chest. She was no longer thinking of failure, no longer thinking of the laughter. She was lost in the music, her own voice surprising her with its strength. She sang of longing, of dreams hidden away. She sang of loneliness and the courage to keep walking. She sang of light that could still shine in the darkest corners. Her song was not just sound, it was a story, her story. and the hall listened. The musicians, who had joined her carefully at first, now played with more confidence. The violin's strings wept softly, the piano's notes rose like gentle waves, and together they carried Myra's song higher, as if the music itself wanted to help her. The chandeliers glittered as though celebrating her, and the golden curtains swayed gently, moved by the faint air of the hall. Everything seemed alive, waiting only for her voice. Minute by minute, the crowd changed. Those who had crossed their arms in pride now had their hands resting still, forgotten. Those who had leaned back with mocking smiles now leaned forward with softened eyes. No one dared to interrupt. No one dared to laugh. Even the host, who had worried the evening was ruined, now watched with his mouth slightly open, unable to believe what was happening. He had hired the greatest singer in the city, but it was the maid who saved the night. Myra's voice reached its peak, soaring high and then falling soft like a whisper of comfort. The melody wrapped around the people, pulling them into her world. Some wept quietly, others stared as though afraid to miss a single moment. For Myra, time seemed to vanish. She was not in the hall anymore. She was not surrounded by mocking faces. She was back in her small room, singing to the silence, except this time, the silence was filled with listening hearts. Her song did not demand respect, it earned it. And when she reached the closing lines, her voice softened, like the end of a prayer. She let the last note linger, fragile and beautiful, before it faded into stillness. The silence that followed was unlike any before. It was not the silence of doubt or mockery, it was the silence of hearts too full to speak. In that moment, Myra had done what no one expected. She had transformed the hall. The final note slipped from Myra's lips like the last glimmer of sunlight before night. It lingered in the air for a heartbeat, soft and trembling, before it faded into silence. The hall stood still. No one moved. No one spoke. For the first time that evening, the silence was not heavy with disappointment or filled with mockery, it was sacred. It was the kind of silence that came only after something too powerful for words. Myra lowered her gaze, her chest rising and falling quickly from the effort. She had sung with every breath, every memory, every piece of her soul. Now, as the stillness stretched on, a small fear returned. Had they liked it? Had they only pitied her? Had her courage been wasted? She felt the heat of the lights above her and the weight of the silence pressing down. She bowed her head, ready to step away. And then it happened. One pair of hands began to clap. The sound was soft at first, echoing in the vast hall. Then another joined, and another, until the applause grew louder and stronger, rising like thunder. In moments, the entire hall was on its feet, clapping, cheering, some even calling out her name, though many had not known it before this night. Myra lifted her eyes, startled. The same guests who had mocked her now stood with shining faces, their hands red from clapping. The same mouths that had laughed now shouted words of praise. Some wept openly, wiping their eyes as if unashamed. The sound washed over her, overwhelming and unreal. She had never imagined applause for herself. She had never imagined being seen not like this. Her knees trembled, and tears filled her eyes. She covered her mouth with her hands, unable to stop the sob that escaped. But this time, it was not sadness. It was relief, it was wonder, it was the joy of finally being heard. The musicians set down their instruments, smiling at her with respect. The host returned to the stage, his face pale with disbelief but glowing with admiration. He raised his hand for silence, though it took a long moment for the applause to settle. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice shaking, "tonight we expected a performance from the greatest singer of our city. But instead we witnessed something far greater. We witnessed truth. We witnessed courage. And we witnessed a voice that will not be forgotten." The crowd roared again, clapping louder than before. Myra stood frozen, hardly believing his words. She had always been invisible, a shadow moving quietly between tables. Now she was being called greater than the star they had come to see. It felt like a dream she might wake from at any moment. But this was no dream. At the back of the hall, the other maids and servants clapped with tears in their eyes. For them, it was not only Myra's victory, it was their own. Someone like them, someone overlooked and unimportant, had stood in the center and silenced the proud. A woman in the front row stepped forward, her silk dress brushing against the floor. "What is her name?" she asked aloud, her voice strong. The host turned toward Myra. "Tell them," he whispered kindly. Myra swallowed hard. Her lips trembled, but she forced herself to speak. "My name is Myra." The hall repeated it, voices rising together. "Myra! Myra!" They called her name as if it had always belonged on their lips. The sound filled her with warmth. For the first time, she felt she truly existed, not as a maid, not as a shadow, but as Myra, a voice that had reached hearts. She bowed deeply, her tears falling freely now. "Thank you," she whispered, though her voice was nearly lost in the thunder of applause. The curtain slowly began to close, the lights dimming. But even as the stage darkened, the sound of her name carried on, echoing in the hall like a promise. When Myra finally stepped down from the stage, her fellow servants rushed to her. They hugged her, their eyes wet with pride. "You were wonderful," one whispered. "You showed them who we are," another said. Myra smiled through her tears. She had not only sung for herself, she had sung for all of them, for everyone who had ever been unseen. As she left the hall that night, the applause still ringing in her ears, she looked up at the starry sky. For years, she had dreamed of singing under the stars. Tonight, she had sung under golden lights, but it felt the same. The sky seemed brighter, as if the stars themselves had listened. Myra knew life would not suddenly become easy. Tomorrow, she would still wear her uniform, still carry trays, still sweep floors. But something had changed forever. She was no longer only a maid. She was someone who had silenced a room with nothing but her heart. And that truth could never be taken away. The night that began with disappointment had ended with triumph. The star performer had cancelled, yes. But in her place, a new star had risen, one born not from fame, but from courage. Her name was Myra. And she would never again be forgotten.